They ask if angels weep. The question rises from the ashes of burned cities, whispered through the ruins of hive spires that touch dying stars. It crawls from the mouths of children who watch their parents turn to ash beneath boots that could crush stone. It echoes in the silence after the guns fall quiet, when the only sound remaining is the drip of blood on consecrated ground and the slow hiss of cooling armor plates blessed by chaplains who have never known mercy. Do angels weep? The woman, clutching her daughter in the rubble of Tertium Secundus, will never know the answer. She watched them descend from gunships that screamed like murdered gods, armored giants 10 feet tall, their shoulders adorned with skulls and purity seals written in languages older than her civilization. She saw them move through her street with the inevitability of a tidal wave, bolters roaring hymns of destruction, each round the size of her fist tearing through flesh and ferrocrete with equal indifference. The heretics died first, then the collaborators, then anyone who stood too close to either category. The Emperor protects, the giants chanted as they worked. The Emperor protects. Her husband had been a factory worker, loyal, faithful. He wore his Aquila pendant every day of his 38 years. When the cultists came, he hid his family in the basement and went to work anyway because the Imperium needed ammunition. And the Imperium was everything, and stopping production was heresy even in the face of death itself. The Space Marines found him there standing at his station, still pulling levers on a munitions press while screams echoed through ventilation shafts and reality itself began to bleed at the edges. They killed him, not quickly, not cruelly, simply thoroughly. A sweep of the facility to ensure no taint remained. He was covered in dust from a collapsed wall. In the dim light and through helmet displays calibrated for war, dust looked enough like ritual ash. Hesitation meant corruption. Corruption meant damnation. The bolter round took him in the chest and continued through the wall behind him, detonating somewhere in the dark where other loyal workers had been hiding. The woman knows this because she heard it. Because in the aftermath, when the cleansing was complete and the giants began their withdrawal, one of them paused near her hiding place. She could see him through the crack in the rubble, a figure rendered in ceramite and faith, his armor the color of storm clouds, marked with chapter iconography she couldn't read. He stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. She counted them. 3 heartbeats where an angel might have questioned. 3 moments where divine certainty flickered. Then he moved on. The Imperium is humanity's last guardian against the night. Every child learns this before they learn their own name. 10,000 years of existence balanced on a knife's edge, trillions of souls bound together by faith and fear and the simple mathematics of survival. The Space Marines are the sword arm of that Imperium, posthuman warriors crafted from the genetic legacy of a god emperor who hasn't spoken in 100 centuries. They are not men. They have not been men since the day the apothecarian cut them open and rebuilt them into something greater, something terrible, something necessary. But the woman in the rubble is not a theologian or a strategist. She knows only what she sees. She sees angels who do not weep. She sees salvation that looks exactly like damnation. She sees the Imperium's mercy, and it is indistinguishable from its wrath. On the agri-world of Solace Prime, the harvest festivals once drew pilgrims from 3 sectors. Families would gather beneath auroral skies to give thanks for another year of survival, another season where the grain grew and the children lived, and the tithe collectors took only what was owed. The Space Marines came there too, pursuing Xenos raiders who had killed 12,000 colonists on a neighboring moon. They caught the raiders in the southern fields during the festival of St. Macarius. The battle lasted 40 minutes. The fields burned for 3 days. The governor petitioned for recompense. The crops were ash. The granaries were destroyed in the crossfire. Without the harvest, the world could not meet its tithe obligations. Without meeting obligations, the administratum would declare them delinquent. Delinquency led to investigation. Investigation led to execution. The Space Marines departed without response. 6 months later, half the population was dead from starvation. The other half survived by burning the dead for warmth and eating whatever could be scraped from the scorched earth. When the tithe collectors arrived, they found a world transformed into a graveyard. The administratum declared Solus Prime non-compliant. Penalty details were dispatched. The survivors were pressed into penal legions and shipped to war zones where their lives could still serve the Imperium's hunger. The Space Marines never returned. Why would they? The Xenos were dead. The Imperium was protected. That some humans died in the process was regrettable but irrelevant. Humans die by the billions every day. What matters is that humanity endures, that the species survives, that the light of the Astronomicon continues to burn. Individual lives are sparks against that eternal flame. Beautiful, perhaps. Brief, certainly. Ultimately meaningless. But tell that to the spark. Tell that to the mother on Tertium Secundus, still clutching her daughter, still hiding in rubble that reeks of promethium and sanctified death. Tell her that her husband's life was mathematics, that his death was necessity, that the angels who killed him were saving her from something worse. Tell her about the warp and its horrors. Tell her about the things that crawl through broken reality, wearing faces she might recognize, speaking with voices she might trust. Tell her that compared to those abominations, a bolt around is mercy. She might even believe you, but she will never forgive. And in the deep places of the Imperium, in the spaces between worlds where information moves slowly and truth moves even slower, that distinction matters. Resentment is a seed. Given time, it grows. Given desperation, it flowers into something the Imperium has a word for, a word spoken in execution chambers and carved into the armor of those same angels. Heresy. The chapter master of the Emperor's Sentinels stood on the observation deck of his battle barge, watching Tertium Secundus recede into the void. Another compliance action completed. Another world saved from corruption. The casualty report scrolled across data slates held by serfs who wouldn't dare meet his gaze. 14,000 civilians dead. Acceptable losses, contamination purged. Mission successful. But somewhere in those numbers was a detail. A fragment. A woman and a child pulled from rubble by PDF forces after the sweep concluded. Cleared by standard genetic and spiritual screening. Released into refugee processing. Assigned to a resettlement convoy heading coreward. The chapter master barely noticed the notation. Why would he? She was just another spark. Just another number. Just another soul in an imperium of uncountable trillions. Insignificant against the weight of eternity. But in the cargo hold of that refugee ship, pressed between strangers who stank of ash and grief, the woman held her daughter close and whispered a single word. A name she had overheard in the days before the angels came. A name the cultists had chanted before they died. A name that promised answers to questions she hadn't known to ask. A name that tasted like freedom. And deep in the warp, something ancient and patient smiled. The refugee convoy traveled for 67 days through the warp. 67 days of Geller field hymns and prayer rotations and the constant subliminal screaming that leaked through reality's thin membrane like blood through gauze. The woman, whose name was Mira, kept her daughter Ela close, taught her to pray louder than the screams, taught her that faith was armor even when armor failed. Around them, other survivors huddled in dim cargo spaces that smelled of recycled air and unwashed bodies and something else, something older like copper and smoke and promises whispered in dreams nobody remembered upon waking. On the 43rd day, a man 2 rows forward began speaking in tongues. The crew threw him out an airlock within the hour. Nobody protested. Everyone had heard the stories. Corruption spread faster than fire in enclosed spaces. One infected soul could doom a ship, could tear reality open and invite things through that wore human skin like stolen coats. Better one dead than thousands damned. The Imperium's math was always simple, always brutal, always correct. Mira watched them drag him away and said nothing. But she remembered his face, remembered that he had been kind once, had shared his rations with children who cried at night, remembered that kindness and corruption were separated by nothing more than desperation, and the things desperation made people willing to hear. The convoy emerged from the warp near Sanctum Majoris, a cardinal world where saints were crowned and heretics were burned, and the ecclesiarchy maintained cathedrals that could be seen from orbit. Mira and Ela were processed through immigration facilities that felt like prisons, sorted by skill level and genetic purity and faith index scores, calculated by machines that measured prayer intensity and eye movement during devotional screenings. They were assigned to Factory District 7, given a HAB unit measuring 3 meters by 4, told to report for work detail in the morning. "The Emperor protects," the administrator said without looking up. "The Emperor provides." That night, Mira dreamed of angels with bloody hands. 3 sectors away, Brother Sergeant Castiel of the Crimson Templars knelt in the Chapel of Sorrows aboard the battle barge, Unbreakable Oath. His armor bore 17 purity seals, each one commemorating a campaign where faith had triumphed over impossible odds. Tertium Secundus was just another seal, another prayer, another world saved from the abyss. He had killed 47 cultists during the purge. He had also killed 19 civilians caught in crossfire or cleansing protocols or the simple arithmetic of tactical necessity. The numbers existed in his post-action report. They did not exist in his prayers. This was not callousness. This was survival. A space marine who questioned every casualty would hesitate. Hesitation meant death. Death meant failure. Failure meant worlds burning and billions screaming and humanity sliding another inch toward extinction. The chapter's chaplain had explained this during his indoctrination, back when he was still mostly human, still capable of doubt. "Faith is certainty," the chaplain had said. "Certainty is strength. Strength is survival. There is no room for mercy in a galaxy that offers none." Castiel believed this, had to believe it, because the alternative was madness. But sometimes in the spaces between battles he remembered faces, a woman in rubble, a child's eyes, the way they looked at him not with gratitude but with something that resembled terror and grief mixed together into an expression he had no name for. He tried to pray the memory away, tried to burn it out with devotion and discipline and the chapter's litanies of purpose. Mostly it worked. Mostly. Tonight it did not. He finished his prayers and stood, servos hissing, joints crackling with the weight of ceramite and duty. Outside the chapel, his squad waited. They had new orders. Intelligence indicated Genestealer infiltration on Sanctum Majoris, the very world where Mira now lived, though Castiel would never know her name or her story or the way his actions on Tertium Secundus had planted seeds that were even now beginning to sprout in darkness. The Crimson Templars would conduct surgical strikes, eliminate the Xenos taint, extract before civilian populations even knew they had been saved. Clean, efficient, holy. Brother Castiel checked his bolter's sacraments and followed his brothers into the armory. Thoughts of doubt were weakness. Weakness was heresy. He would be strong. He would be certain. He would be what the Imperium needed him to be, even if it killed him, even if it killed everyone. Inquisitor Valerian of the Ordo Hereticus read the report 3 times before believing it. Genestealer cults typically took decades to mature, generations of careful breeding and psychic conditioning before they grew strong enough to threaten a cardinal world. But Sanctum Majoris showed contamination markers consistent with accelerated development, as if something were pushing the cult's evolution forward, feeding it energy from somewhere outside normal Xenos biology. The data slate in his augmetic hand displayed genetic samples, intercepted Vox transmissions, surveillance footage of infected citizens gathering in underhive churches that shouldn't exist. All of it pointed toward infiltration. All of it screamed invasion. But one detail bothered him. One fragment that didn't fit the pattern. Several of the cult's newest converts were refugees from Tertium Secundus. recent arrivals, too recent for traditional genestealer infection cycles. Yet their faith indices had dropped precipitously since arrival. Their prayer compliance was failing. Their devotional fervor was being replaced by something the monitoring algorithms flagged as concerning but couldn't quite categorize. Resentment, perhaps. Disillusionment. The first cracks in the armor of belief that the Imperium wrapped around every citizen from birth. Valerian understood heresy better than most. He had studied it for 2 centuries, watched it bloom in 1,000 different forms across 100 worlds. Sometimes it wore the face of chaos, sometimes Xenos, sometimes something harder to define, something that grew from the Imperium's own actions, from the weight of its cruelty and the mathematics of its indifference. The Imperium created its own enemies more often than it cared to admit, saved worlds by destroying them, protected humanity by grinding individual humans into paste. This was necessary. Valerian believed that, had to believe it, but belief and understanding were not the same thing. He marked the report for Astartes' intervention and approved orbital monitoring. The Crimson Templars would handle the tactical response. He would handle the investigation. Between them, they would burn out the infection before it spread. More sparks extinguished. More lives traded for humanity's continuation. "The Emperor protects," he whispered to the empty room. Nobody answered. In Factory District 7, Mira worked 16-hour shifts assembling munitions components for a war she would never see on a front she couldn't name. Ella was enrolled in a Schola Progenium feeder program, where children learned to pray in unison and recite Imperial catechisms and identify heretical iconography before they learned basic mathematics. This was normal. This was life. This was the Imperium's love expressed through regimentation and surveillance, and the certainty that every action served a purpose larger than individual comprehension. But in the 3rd week, Mira met a woman named Yara who worked the adjacent assembly line. Yara had kind eyes and a scar across her throat and a way of speaking that suggested she had once been someone important before whatever catastrophe had reduced her to factory work. They shared rations during break periods, traded stories about the homes they had lost, the lives they had lived before angels descended and redrew reality in fire and faith. Yara asked careful questions about Tertium Secundus, about what Mira had seen, about how she felt watching her world burn in the name of salvation. And Mira, exhausted and grieving and so desperately alone, answered honestly, told her about the rubble and the screams and the moment an angel paused for 3 heartbeats and then walked away. Told her about her husband, loyal until death, killed by the Imperium he had served without question. Yara listened with an expression that might have been sympathy or something deeper, something that recognized familiar pain reflected back like light through shattered glass. "Would you like to meet others who understand?" Yara asked on the 21st day. Mira hesitated. Somewhere in her mind, warning bells rang. The catechism she had memorized. The lessons about corruption. The knowledge that questioning the Imperium's methods was the first step toward questioning its authority, and questioning its authority was heresy, and heresy was damnation. But she was so tired, so broken, so desperate for someone to tell her that her pain mattered, that her husband's death meant something, that angels should weep when they kill the faithful. "Yes," she said, and Yara smiled. Deep beneath Factory District 7, in tunnels that predated the current city level by 3,000 years, something stirred. Not Xenos, not chaos, not yet. Just people gathering in darkness, sharing grief, finding solidarity in suffering. They called themselves the Forgotten Faithful. They prayed to the Emperor still, but their prayers were questions now instead of affirmations. They asked why salvation looked like slaughter, why faith demanded such sacrifice, why the Imperium's love felt exactly like its hatred. These were dangerous questions, the kind that opened doors better left sealed, the kind that attracted attention from things that fed on doubt and pain, and the small treasons that grew in hearts the Imperium had broken. In orbit, Brother Sergeant Castiel prepared for deployment, checking his war gear with ritual precision. On Sanctum Majoris, Inquisitor Valerian reviewed surveillance footage of Underhive gatherings, marking faces for interrogation. And in the warp, in spaces between spaces where time moved strangely and causation was merely suggestion, something ancient watched the pieces move across the board and laughed with voices that sounded almost human. Mira descended into the tunnels with Yara on the 31st day, holding Ella's hand, seeking answers or comfort or simply acknowledgement that her suffering was real. She found a congregation. 200 souls, maybe more, gathered around a makeshift altar where an aquila hung inverted, not in blasphemy, but in question, as if asking the emperor to look down and see what his Imperium had become. They sang hymns she recognized but with altered words, verses that asked for mercy instead of strength, forgiveness instead of fury, grace instead of victory. The woman leading them wore ecclesiarchy robes stripped of their insignia, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had believed absolutely and been broken by that belief. "Welcome, sister," she said to Mira. "Welcome to those who remember that we are human." And somewhere above, in the eternal night of the void, gunships began their descent. The gunships descended like falling stars wrapped in scripture, their engines screaming hymns that shattered windows across 3 city blocks. Brother Sergeant Castiel stood in the deployment bay watching the world grow larger through reinforced viewports, his mind calibrated for war, his hearts beating in perfect synchronization with targeting systems that had already marked 17 sites for purification. Intelligence suggested the Genestealer cult had established nest structures beneath Factory District 7. Standard protocol demanded overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, extract the tumor, cauterize the wound, leave the body intact enough to continue serving. The Crimson Templars had performed this operation on 43 worlds. Castiel had personally led purges on 11 of them. The procedure was familiar, almost meditative in its execution. Drop, advance, identify, eliminate, extract. The mathematics of salvation reduced to a checklist that could be completed between morning prayers and evening devotionals. He checked his bolter's machine spirit one final time, whispered the litany of accuracy, and waited for the deployment light to flash green. But something felt wrong. Some instinct inherited from the Primarch, some fragment of enhanced cognition that existed below conscious thought. The intelligence reports were too clean, the cult's growth too aggressive, the pattern too perfect, as if designed to provoke exactly this response from exactly these warriors at exactly this time. Castiel dismissed the thought. Doubt was weakness. Weakness was death. The chaplain's words echoed through decades of conditioning. Trust the mission. Trust your brothers. Trust the Emperor's will. The light flashed green. In the tunnels, Mira listened to the woman in stripped robes speak about mercy and humanity, and the distinction between faith in the Emperor and faith in the Imperium that claimed to speak for him. The words were dangerous, seditious, possibly heretical, but they resonated with something deep in her chest where grief had been living like a parasite for 31 days. Around her, the forgotten faithful murmured agreements, shared stories of loved ones lost to imperial necessity, worlds saved by being destroyed, lives sacrificed for calculations they would never understand. This was therapy disguised as blasphemy, or maybe blasphemy disguised as therapy. Mira couldn't tell anymore, didn't care. For the first time since watching angels kill her husband, she felt seen. Ella pressed against her mother's side, small fingers gripping fabric, eyes wide as she absorbed words no child should need to hear. That the Imperium was vast and cruel and necessary. That sometimes salvation looked like damnation. That the Emperor might still love them even if his servants did not. Mira stroked her daughter's hair and wondered what kind of world required children to understand such things. Wondered if the Emperor wept for them, Wherever he was, locked in his golden throne, silent for 10,000 years while his Imperium ground trillions into dust in his name, the woman in robes raised her hands for silence. "We do not deny the Emperor," she said. "We question those who speak for him. We question whether angels who cannot weep can truly understand what they protect. We question whether humanity's survival requires humanity's death." Above them, something exploded. The first breaching charge took out the tunnel entrance in a cascade of rockcrete and fire. Castiel led his squad through the breach, bolter raised, helmet display painting the underground complex in threat assessment overlays. Thermal signatures scattered like roaches exposed to light. 87 contacts, 93, 112. Too many for a covert gathering. Too organized for random heretics. The cult was here, had to be. Intelligence was never wrong, could not be wrong. Because if intelligence was wrong, then what they were about to do was murder instead of justice, and that distinction mattered more than Castiel had words to articulate. He advanced through smoke and screaming, following tactical markers that painted targets in his vision. A man running with something clutched to his chest. Threat assessment calculated 73% probability of explosive device. Castiel fired. The bolter round took the man in the spine, detonating inside his body cavity, painting the wall behind him in red mist. Except there was no explosive. Just a child, a girl, maybe 5 years old. The man had been running away with his daughter. Castiel's enhanced eyes registered her face for 1.3 seconds before she hit the ground. Her expression wasn't fear. It was confusion, like she couldn't understand why the angel had done this. He kept advancing. Pushed the image away. Locked it behind mental bulwarks that 100 other such images already occupied. This was war. War had costs. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. Inquisitor Valerian watched the tactical feed from orbit, tracking the Astartes' advance through augmented reality overlays that turned war into geometry. Acceptable casualties were mounting. 17 civilians confirmed dead. 23, 41, parameters within normal range for urban tunnel fighting. The cult would be rooted out. Sanctum Majoris would be saved. Another world preserved for the Imperium's eternal hunger. He should have felt satisfaction, victory, purpose. Instead, he felt something that might have been nausea if his augmented physiology still permitted such weakness. The surveillance footage kept cycling through his neural implants, the forgotten faithful gathering in candlelight. Their prayers, their questions. Their crime was doubt expressed collectively. Their punishment was death delivered divinely. This was justice. Had to be justice. Because the alternative was that the Imperium created more heretics than it killed, pushed faithful citizens toward corruption through the weight of its own cruelty, and that thought was too dangerous to complete. Valerian had executed men for less treasonous contemplations. He forced his attention back to tactical displays and authorized a second wave of troops. Arbeit's units, local enforcers, bodies to fill the tunnels and flush out any survivors the Space Marines missed. Efficient, thorough, necessary. Mira ran through darkness with Ela clutched against her chest. The child's weight nothing compared to the terror that turned her blood to ice and her thoughts to static. The tunnels were collapsing, carved apart by explosions that sounded like the universe screaming. People fell around her, torn apart by rounds that moved faster than sound, fired by angels who saw only threats and targets and acceptable losses. She had come here seeking answers, found only more questions written in blood and concrete dust. Why did faith require such violence? Why did salvation always arrive too late? Why did the Emperor's mercy look exactly like his wrath? She turned a corner and found Yara pressed against a wall, bleeding from a wound in her shoulder, her kind eyes now filled with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," Yara whispered. "I'm so sorry. We thought we had more time. Thought we could find others like us. Build something. Show the Imperium there was another way. But they always find us, always burn us, always make examples so others won't question, won't doubt, won't remember that we're supposed to be human. Behind them, armored footsteps echoed like judgment approaching. Mira grabbed Yara's hand, pulled her forward, ran deeper into tunnels that twisted like intestines through the city's ancient corpse. Somewhere ahead, there had to be another exit, another chance, another moment where survival was possible. She refused to believe the Emperor would let them die here, refused to accept that her daughter's last memory would be darkness and screaming, and the knowledge that angels did not weep. Castiel cleared room after room, each one a repeat of the last. Frightened civilians, makeshift altars, no genestealer corruption, no Xenos taint, no four-armed hybrids or psychic patriarchs or any of the markers intelligence had promised. Just people. Terrified. Faithful. Guilty only of asking questions in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong words. His squad reported similar findings through Vox channels. Brother Matthias had eliminated a cell of 15 conducting prayer study. Brother Tarkus had purged a group debating theological interpretations. Brother Hadrian had sterilized a family hiding in a storage chamber, parents shielding children who clutched Aquila pendants and cried for the Emperor to save them. Something was wrong. Something was fundamentally, terribly wrong. But Castiel couldn't stop. To stop was to question. To question was to doubt. To doubt was to fail. He had eliminated 37 targets. Confirmed kills. Mission parameters satisfied. Extract protocol would initiate in 4 minutes. The Crimson Templars would withdraw, leaving local authorities to process survivors and restore order. Another successful operation. Another world saved. Except nothing felt saved. Everything felt broken in ways his conditioning had never prepared him to process. He reached the deepest chamber and found them. A woman clutching a child. Another woman bleeding beside them. All three pressed against a dead-end wall where ancient stonework bore inscriptions that predated the Imperium by millennia. They looked at him with eyes that held no hope, only acceptance of the inevitable. The child's face was the same one he had seen earlier. No, different girl, same expression. That confusion, that question. Why are the angels killing us? Castiel raised his bolter. Targeting reticle centered on the woman's head. His finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze, one round. Mission complete. But his hand wouldn't move. Couldn't move. Because 37 kills had been mathematics and this would be murder, and somewhere in his psycho-indoctrinated mind the distinction still mattered even though it shouldn't, even though he had been rebuilt to exist beyond such concerns. Even though humanity's survival required exactly this kind of sacrifice. The woman met his eyes through his helmet's lenses. She didn't beg, didn't plead, just asked a single question in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper. "Does he know what you do in his name?" Something inside Castiel's chest cracked. Not physically, deeper. Somewhere the apothecarian's knives had never reached. He lowered his weapon. Slowly, against every protocol and conditioning and oath he had sworn, heard his own voice speaking words that would haunt him forever. Run. Find somewhere safe. Pray he forgives us all. The women stared in disbelief, then moved, scrambled past him through the smoke toward distant exits, the child's footsteps echoing like accusations. Castiel stood alone in the empty chamber watching them disappear, knowing he had just committed the worst kind of heresy. Not treachery against the Imperium. Mercy that undermined its logic. Because if these three deserved to live, then what about the 37 he had already killed? What about the thousands on Tertium Secundus? What about the millions across 100 campaigns who had died beneath his righteousness? His vox crackled. Brother Sergeant, extraction in 90 seconds. Confirm status. Castiel closed his eyes behind his helmet and lied to his brothers for the first time in 70 years. Status confirmed. Proceeding to extraction point. Then he deleted the chamber's tactical recordings, purged the engagement logs, ensured no evidence remained of his failure, his weakness, his humanity. The Crimson Templars extracted under covering fire, leaving Factory District 7 smoking and broken. Local casualties: 217 confirmed. Cult eliminated. 0 actual xenoforms found. Intelligence had been wrong, or something had manipulated the intelligence, or the Imperium had simply decided these particular citizens needed to die and dressed it up as Xenos purging because that was easier than admitting it was executing people for the crime of doubt. Castiel filed his report without amendment, accepted commendations for a successful operation, received another purity seal to add to his armor, went to the Chapel of Sorrows and prayed until his knees bled. Inquisitor Valerian reviewed the data and felt that dangerous nausea again. Something didn't add up. The cult markers had been real enough to trigger the investigation, but the cult itself never materialized, as if someone had planted evidence specifically to provoke a purge of a group that wasn't actually corrupted, just questioning, which meant either they had been manipulated or they had been lied to, or the Imperium's own paranoia had created the very heresy it claimed to fight. All three possibilities were equally terrifying. All three suggested rot at foundations supposed to be eternal. He marked the incident for further investigation, then immediately unmarked it. Some truths were too dangerous to pursue. Some questions undermined the entire structure upon which human survival balanced. Better to accept the official narrative. Cult eliminated. World saved. Citizens reminded that faith requires obedience, and obedience requires silence. The mathematics worked even if the morality didn't. And morality was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. Mira emerged from the tunnels 3 days later, half-starved, traumatized beyond language, but alive. Ella clung to her with fingers that had forgotten how to release. They processed through refugee centers again, assigned new identification codes, given new work assignments far from Factory District 7. The Imperium was efficient if nothing else, documented their survival, cataloged their trauma, sent them back into the machine that had already broken them once and would break them again because that was what machines did to anything soft enough to feel. But something had changed. Some fundamental understanding had crystallized during those 3 days in darkness. The Imperium did not love them, perhaps could not love them. It loved humanity as an abstract concept, a species to be preserved, but individual humans were interchangeable components in an engine that ran on blood and faith and the grinding certainty that any cruelty was justified if it delayed extinction by even a single day. And maybe that was true. Maybe the galaxy really was so hostile that only absolute brutality could ensure survival. But if that was the cost of existing, Mira wondered if existence was worth the price. She thought about the angel who had lowered his weapon, who had given them a chance despite every law and oath demanding otherwise, who had shown mercy in a universe that considered mercy weakness. She didn't know his name, would never know his name, but she remembered his hesitation, that moment where divinity flickered and something almost human showed through the cracks. If an angel could doubt, then perhaps doubt wasn't heresy. Perhaps it was the only honest response to an Imperium that demanded faith while practicing damnation. Yara had died in the tunnels, bled out from her wound while Mira and Ela ran. Her last words were a prayer that sounded more like accusation. "Emperor, if you're there, if you can hear us, please tell your angels to remember we're human. Please let them weep for what they do. Please let their hearts break so ours don't have to." Then silence. Then death. Then 2 more names added to an infinite list of acceptable losses. Weeks passed. Months. Mira worked her new assignment, raised her daughter, recited the required prayers with voice empty of everything but survival instinct. But at night, in dreams, she saw tunnels and angels, and a moment where mercy had existed like a spark in absolute darkness. And she wondered if that spark could spread. If others had seen similar moments. If somewhere in the Imperium's endless cruelty there were enough cracks in the armor of faith for light to leak through. She didn't know that across the sector, Brother Sergeant Castiel was asking himself the same questions. That his moment of weakness had infected him like a slow poison, making him question orders, hesitate during purges, see faces instead of targets. That his brothers had noticed the change but said nothing because Space Marines did not acknowledge doubt, and acknowledging it made it real. That the chapter's chaplain was watching him with increasing concern, ready to intervene before his heresy spread. She didn't know that Inquisitor Valerian had buried the investigation but couldn't bury his thoughts. That, late at night in his chambers, he reviewed footage of the Forgotten Faithful and saw not heretics but victims. That he had begun compiling secret reports documenting cases where Imperial justice looked suspiciously like Imperial cruelty. That he was dangerous now, to himself and the Inquisition, because he had learned too much and questioned too deeply and couldn't unlearn what he knew. 3 souls separated by rank and distance and purpose, all infected by the same doubt, all carrying the same poison, all wondering if the Emperor's Imperium had become something he would recognize, something he would approve, or something that had twisted his vision into a nightmare that called itself salvation while practicing damnation. And in the warp, in spaces where causation was merely suggestion and time folded back on itself like origami made from screaming, something watched these 3 sparks with interest. Not a god, not yet. Just a concept gathering strength, an idea fed by doubt and grief and the small treasons that grew in hearts the Imperium had broken. It had many names across many cultures. The fallen faithful called it liberation. The ruinous powers called it opportunity. The Imperium would call it heresy, but its true name was simpler, more honest, more terrible in its implications. Hope. And hope, in a galaxy designed to crush it, was the most dangerous corruption of all. Hope spread like radiation, invisible and lethal, carried by survivors who didn't know they were infected. Mira spoke to no one about what she had seen in the tunnels, but her silence had a quality that other broken people recognized, a frequency of grief that resonated with those who had been saved by being destroyed. They found each other in factory break rooms and refugee processing centers and hab block stairwells where surveillance was sporadic. Didn't speak of heresy or rebellion or anything that might trigger monitoring algorithms. Just shared stories, losses, questions wrapped in prayers that sounded orthodox but carried subtext like poison hidden in sacramental wine. On the Forge world of Metallicus Prime, a woman whose husband had been executed for slowness during an Imperial Guard recruitment drive listened to Mira's story through encrypted Vox channels and wept for reasons she couldn't name. On the Hive world of Coruscant Tertius, a man whose daughter had been killed by Astartes' collateral damage heard about the angel who hesitated and felt something shift in his chest where faith had been dying for years. Word spread. Not organized, not coordinated, just grief recognizing grief across the void, sparks finding each other in darkness, asking the same forbidden question. If angels can doubt, why can't we? Brother Sergeant Castiel performed his duties with mechanical precision that his brothers mistook for devotion. Morning prayers, combat drills, weapon maintenance, tactical briefings. He followed every protocol, exceeded every standard, led his squad through 3 more compliance actions with efficiency that earned commendations from the chapter master. But inside, behind mental bulwarks that were beginning to crack, he was drowning. Every target he eliminated wore the woman's face. Every confirmed kill asked the child's question. Does he know what you do in his name? The chaplain summoned him on the 73rd day. Brother Castiel, your service record is exemplary. Your faith appears absolute, yet I sense a shadow in you. The words were gentle, almost fatherly, which made them more terrifying than any accusation. Castiel knelt as protocol demanded, helmet removed, exposing his face to a superior who could read micro-expressions invisible to baseline humans. I am faithful, he said, I serve the Emperor without question." The chaplain studied him for 17 seconds, then spoke words that felt like a scalpel opening his chest. "Faith without doubt is not faith, brother. It is programming. And you, I think, have begun to remember you were human once." Castiel said nothing. Couldn't say anything, because confirming would be confession, and denying would be lying to someone whose entire purpose was detecting exactly such lies. The chaplain circled him slowly, armor joints whispering like prayers. "I have served the chapter for 3 centuries. I have seen brothers fall to every corruption the galaxy offers: chaos, Xenos, heresy. But the most dangerous fall is not into darkness, brother. It is into the light, into mercy, into the belief that individual lives matter more than humanity's survival. That belief is seductive, beautiful, absolutely fatal." The words landed like bolter rounds, each one precisely targeted, perfectly aimed. Castiel felt his conditioning reasserting itself, mental disciplines rising like walls against the infection of doubt. "You are right, chaplain. I will purge this weakness. More prayer, more discipline. The Emperor protects." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow, knew that something inside him had broken beyond repair, knew that the moment he had shown mercy he had stepped onto a path that ended only in damnation or revelation, and perhaps they were the same thing. The chaplain placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture almost gentle despite the ceramite separating flesh from flesh. "You will report for spiritual counseling daily until I am satisfied the shadow has passed." Dismissed. Castiel rose, saluted, left the chapel with his spine straight and his expression controlled. But his hands were shaking. Had been shaking since Sanctum Majoris. Would probably shake until the day he died, or was executed for the heresy growing in his hearts like a cancer that felt suspiciously like conscience. Inquisitor Valerian's secret investigation had grown from curiosity to obsession, to something that might have been madness. His personal archives now contained 17,000 documented cases of Imperial forces killing loyal citizens under pretense of purging corruption. 17,000 instances where faith had not been enough, where devotion had not protected, where the Imperium's mathematics had decided some lives were acceptable losses, and those lives had screamed the Emperor's name while dying anyway. The patterns were undeniable. The Imperium created heretics faster than it killed them, pushed faithful citizens toward corruption through the weight of its own cruelty. Measured success in body counts that included millions who had done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. This should have been revelatory. Instead, it was confirming what Valerian had suspected for decades but lacked the courage to articulate. The Imperium was not evil. It was worse. It was necessary evil calcified into eternal policy. Brutality become doctrine. Cruelty transformed into virtue through 10,000 years of rationalization. And perhaps the galaxy really was hostile enough to justify such measures. Perhaps humanity's survival really did require grinding trillions into paste. But if that was true, then what exactly were they surviving for? What remained of humanity worth preserving if preservation required destroying everything that made humans human? He encrypted the files, hid them in data vaults protected by codes only he knew, and prepared to do absolutely nothing with the information. Because Valerian was many things, but he was not stupid. Publishing this research meant execution. Sharing it meant execution. Even possessing it was probably execution. The Inquisition did not tolerate questions about the Imperium's fundamental nature. Those who looked too deeply at the foundations inevitably found rot, and rot was contagious, and contagion had to be purged. So the files would remain hidden. The truth would stay buried. And Valerian would continue serving an Imperium he no longer believed in, because belief was irrelevant, and service was everything, and stopping meant admitting the last 2 centuries had been spent enforcing lies. Except he couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the child, about the angel who had hesitated, about the moment Mercy had existed in a universe designed to crush it. Those 3 sparks had infected him worse than any chaos corruption. Made him wonder if the Imperium's greatest enemy wasn't Xenos or warp spawn, but its own citizens finally realizing they deserved better than eternal suffering, justified by the mathematics of survival. Mira received a visitor on the 104th day. A man in ecclesiarchy robes, face hidden by a hood, bearing no identification or authority markers. He found her in her hab unit after work shift, appeared like a ghost through security systems that should have prevented unauthorized entry. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I come with a message. From those who remember what faith meant before the Imperium redefined it as obedience." She should have reported him immediately, should have activated emergency Vox channels and called Arbeits units. Instead, she listened. The man spoke of a network. Not organized, not centralized. Just people scattered across sectors who had been broken by the Imperium's love and reformed themselves into something the Imperium would call heresy, but they called hope. They did not worship chaos, did not betray humanity, simply believed that faith in the Emperor did not require faith in the Imperium that claimed to speak for him, that asking questions was not heresy, that angels who could not weep had forgotten what they were supposed to protect. "We do not seek rebellion," the man said. "We seek remembrance. We seek to preserve what remains of our humanity before the Imperium grinds it into dust in the Emperor's name." Mira listened and felt something awakening in her chest where grief had been living like a parasite. This was dangerous. This was probably heresy. This would get her killed and her daughter orphaned and her name added to lists of traitors and enemies and acceptable losses. But the man's words resonated with something she had been feeling since the tunnels, since watching an angel hesitate, since realizing that mercy still existed even in a galaxy designed to punish it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," the man said. "Everything. To remember you are human. To teach your daughter she is human. To exist as proof that the Imperium has not completely succeeded in transforming faith into slavery. We do not ask you to fight. We ask you to live, to question, to remember that angels should weep when they kill the faithful. That alone is rebellion enough." He left through the same route he had entered, disappearing like smoke through ventilation systems. Mira stood in her hab unit holding Ela close, feeling the weight of a choice she hadn't realized she was making. Stay silent, obey, survive through compliance, or speak, question, risk everything for the possibility that humanity meant more than survival, that faith required more than obedience, that the Emperor's vision had been corrupted by 10,000 years of those who claimed to serve him. She thought about her husband dying at his station, loyal until the end, killed by the salvation he had trusted. Thought about Yara bleeding out in tunnels while praying for angels to remember their humanity. Thought about 217 acceptable losses in Factory District 7 whose only crime had been asking questions in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thought about the angel who had lowered his weapon and given them a chance despite everything his conditioning demanded. Then she made her choice. Across the sector, Castiel endured his daily spiritual counseling, reciting catechisms and prayers while the chaplain watched for signs of corruption. He performed perfectly, said everything the chaplain needed to hear, displayed faith and certainty and absolute devotion to the chapter and the Emperor and the Imperium's eternal mission. But at night, in his personal quarters, he accessed encrypted channels he should not have known existed and read accounts from other Astartes, other brothers from other chapters who had experienced similar moments, who had shown mercy and been infected by it, who were drowning in doubt while maintaining perfect exteriors. The network was small, perhaps 24 Space Marines across 5 chapters. They did not communicate directly. Too dangerous. Instead, they left messages in places only they would look, encoded in tactical reports and maintenance logs and prayer rotations. Small confessions wrapped in orthodoxy. "I spared civilians during a purge and cannot stop thinking about their faces." I questioned an order to execute refugees, and now doubt eats at me like acid. I showed mercy once, and it ruined me for war. Castiel added his own account, kept it vague, wrapped it in theological language that could be interpreted as orthodox contemplation rather than heretical confession. But the meaning was there for those who knew how to read it. I hesitated. I let them live. I do not know if this makes me weak or finally strong. And somewhere in the network, other brothers read his words and felt less alone in their damnation. Inquisitor Valerian detected fragments of the network through routine surveillance monitoring. Not enough to identify individuals, just patterns, anomalies in Astartes' communication protocols, theological discussions that asked questions. Space Marines were not supposed to ask. He should have investigated, should have assembled teams to root out this infection before it spread. Instead, he encrypted his findings, marked them classified beyond even inquisitorial access, and pretended he had never seen them. Because if Space Marines could doubt, then doubt was not weakness. It was intelligence, conscience, humanity reasserting itself against conditioning designed to crush it. And if the Imperium's greatest warriors were beginning to question, then perhaps the entire edifice was closer to collapse than anyone wanted to admit. The storm was building. 3 sparks that should have been extinguished but somehow survived. Mira teaching her daughter that questions were not heresy. Castiel leading his squad while dying inside from accumulated mercy. Valerian enforcing laws he no longer believed in while documenting their injustice. Each one alone was insignificant. Together they were sedition. Given time, they would become something the Imperium had a word for, a word spoken in execution chambers and carved into the armor of those who betrayed their oaths. But time was running out. Because in the warp, in spaces where hope became energy and grief became power, something was watching these sparks with hunger that transcended physical appetite. The ruinous powers had existed for eons, feeding on humanity's darkest impulses. Rage, despair, ambition, pleasure twisted into addiction. But they had never successfully weaponized hope before, never transformed faith-turned doubt into something that could shatter the Imperium from within more effectively than any demon horde. Until now. The entity forming in the warp had no name yet, no shape, no clear purpose beyond feeding on the emotional resonance of those who loved the Emperor but hated his Imperium. It was not chaos in the traditional sense. It was something newer, something born from 10,000 years of brutal necessity creating its own opposition, something that whispered to the faithful in voices that sounded like conscience and offered liberation through the simple act of remaining human in a galaxy that demanded they become machines. Mira heard it in her dreams, a voice that sounded almost like her husband's, asking if she would trade humanity's survival for humanity's soul. Castiel heard it during prayers, a whisper beneath the litany suggesting that mercy was strength and certainty was cowardice. Valerian heard it in the silence between his thoughts, questioning whether truth mattered more than duty when duty required enforcing lies. None of them knew they were hearing the same voice. None of them knew they were being shaped into weapons against the very Imperium they still, despite everything, wanted to serve. None of them knew that their doubt was becoming power, their questions becoming corruption, their humanity becoming the exact heresy the Imperium had always warned them against. But somewhere in the depths of Terra, locked in his golden throne, drowning in agony that had lasted longer than civilizations, the Emperor stirred. Not physically. He had not moved in 10,000 years. But psychically, in ways that transcended mortal comprehension, he felt the disturbance. Felt 3 sparks burning in darkness. Felt hope becoming corruption. Felt his Imperium's brutality creating exactly the heresy it claimed to fight. And if he could have wept, if his desiccated form still possessed tear ducts that functioned, if 10 millennia of agony had not burned away everything except will and purpose, he might have mourned for what his vision had become. For the Imperium that spoke in his name while practicing damnation. For the angels who had forgotten how to be human. For the faithful he could not protect from their own protectors. But he could not weep, could only watch, could only endure, could only burn in eternal torment while his children devoured each other in his name and called it salvation. The storm was building. The sparks were spreading, and soon, very soon, something would break. Some dam would fail, some threshold would be crossed, and when it did, the Imperium would face a choice it had avoided for 10,000 years. Remember its humanity, or abandon it completely. The galaxy held its breath. History prepared to turn. And in the spaces between moments, in the silence before the scream, 3 souls stood on the edge of damnation wondering if the fall would feel like freedom or just a different kind of chains. The breaking point came on a world called Penance, during a compliance action that would never appear in official records. The Crimson Templars descended to purge a reported Genestealer cult, and Brother Sergeant Castiel led his squad through hab blocks that smelled of incense and fear and prayers spoken too loudly to mask the sound of children crying. Intelligence had been certain this time. Biomass signatures, psychic disturbances, communication patterns consistent with Xenos infiltration. But when they breached the first gathering site, Castiel found only people, hundreds of them, praying in a style that was unorthodox but not heretical, asking questions that were dangerous but not corrupt, seeking answers the ecclesiarchy refused to provide. The woman leading them wore scars that spelled out Imperial hymns carved into her flesh by her own hand. Proof of devotion, evidence of faith taken to extremes the Imperium should have celebrated. Instead, she was marked for termination because her prayers had the wrong emphasis, asked uncomfortable questions about why salvation required so much suffering. Castiel's targeting reticle painted her chest. His finger rested on the trigger. Around him, his squad waited for the order. Protocol demanded immediate engagement. Hesitation meant corruption. Corruption meant failure. He had hesitated once before, and the memory had been killing him slowly ever since. The woman met his eyes through his helmet's lenses and spoke words that felt like they had been waiting his entire life to be said. "We are not your enemy, Angel. We are what you were supposed to protect. We love the Emperor. We question those who speak for him while crushing us. Is that heresy? Or is heresy pretending faith requires suffering when faith should bring grace?" She opened her arms, exposing her chest to his bolter. "If you must kill us, then kill us. But know that you kill the faithful. Know that you serve an Imperium that has forgotten the difference between devotion and slavery. Know that the Emperor weeps for what you do in his name, even if you cannot." Something inside Castiel shattered. Not cracked, not fractured, shattered completely, irrevocably. The kind of breaking that could never be repaired because once you saw the truth, you could not unsee it. He lowered his bolter, heard his own voice speaking through external Vox speakers, words that would doom him but felt more true than any oath he had ever sworn. "Stand down. No hostiles detected. Intel was compromised. We are withdrawing." His squad hesitated. Brother Matthias's voice crackled through internal Vox. "Sergeant, visual confirmation shows mass gathering. Protocol requires engagement." Castiel felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Every battle, every purge, every moment he had followed orders without question because questioning was weakness, and weakness was death. But he was so tired, so broken, so completely done with being the Imperium's instrument of brutality dressed up as salvation. "I said stand down," he repeated. "That is an order." The moment stretched. His squad could report him, could override his authority, could execute him on the spot for dereliction. But they had served together for decades, had trusted him with their lives through campaigns that should have killed them all, and trust was the only currency worth anything in the infinite horror of the 41st millennium. Brother Tarkus was first to lower his weapon, then Brother Hadrian, then Brother Matthias, though his Vox carried doubt that tasted like acid. Confirmed. Standing down. Castiel led them out of the hab block, away from the gathered faithful, toward extraction that would bring interrogation and judgment and probably execution. But behind him, 400 people lived who should have died. 400 sparks that would spread their questions across the sector. 400 witnesses to the moment an angel chose mercy over duty and survived long enough to wonder if it had been worth the cost. The chaplain was waiting when they returned to the battle barge. Castiel reported directly to his chambers, helmet removed, head bowed, prepared for the execution he knew was coming. Instead, the chaplain spoke words that felt like benediction and damnation mixed together. "You are not the first to falter, brother, nor will you be the last. The Codex Astartes teaches that we are the Emperor's angels of death, but we were human once, and some of us remember." He paused, servo skull hovering near his shoulder, recording everything. The chapter is fracturing Castiel, not from without, but from within. Too many brothers asking questions, too many moments of mercy, too many cracks in certainty. I have reported this to the chapter master. He has requested inquisitorial investigation. Castiel's blood turned cold. Inquisitorial investigation meant memory scrubbing at best, execution at worst, the entire chapter placed under suspicion of corruption. His failure had not just doomed him. It had endangered every brother who had ever shown mercy, who had ever hesitated, who had ever remembered they were supposed to protect humanity, not just humanity's abstract survival. "I will accept whatever punishment is required," he said, "but my squad is innocent. They followed my orders. The corruption is mine alone." The chaplain's expression was unreadable behind his skull helm. "You misunderstand, brother. You are not corrupted. You are infected with something worse. Humanity, conscience, the belief that individual lives matter. These are not chaos taint. They are simply incompatible with what we must be to fulfill our purpose." He reached out and placed a hand on Castiel's shoulder. "You are a good soldier, Castiel. Perhaps the best I have trained. But good soldiers in a war this brutal must be more than good. They must be absolute, and you have lost your absoluteness." Castiel knew what came next. Knew it with the certainty of someone who had spent 70 years enforcing the same sentence on others. "I am ready for execution, chaplain." The chaplain's grip tightened. "No, you are ready for a choice. Remain and be broken back into certainty through methods that will destroy what makes you question. Or leave. Disappear. Take your infection somewhere the chapter cannot follow." He leaned closer, voice dropping to whisper. "There are places beyond the Imperium's light where mercy is not weakness, where questions are permitted, where angels go to die with their humanity intact. Find them, or be unmade here. But choose quickly. The Inquisition arrives within the week. The offer was more terrifying than execution, because execution was simple, final, but exile meant living with his doubt, carrying his questions into darkness, becoming the very heresy he had spent his life fighting. Yet something in him leaped at the possibility, the chance to exist as something other than the Imperium's weapon, to find meaning in mercy rather than mathematics, to see if faith could survive outside the structure that had weaponized it into brutality. "I will leave," he said, "tonight, before the Inquisition arrives." The chaplain nodded, released his shoulder, stepped back. "Then you are no longer Brother Sergeant Castiel of the Crimson Templars. You are nothing, no one, a ghost that will haunt my conscience until the Emperor grants me peace." He raised his Crozius Arcanum in something that might have been blessing or farewell or simply acknowledgement. "May he protect you, fallen angel, even from himself." Castiel left through maintenance passages known only to chapter serfs, stole a Thunderhawk during shift rotation, burned toward the system's edge while behind him the battle barge grew small and distant and eventually disappeared into the starfield like a memory he could almost forget. He did not know where he was going, did not know if places of mercy actually existed beyond the Imperium's grip, did not know if his exile would save his brothers or doom them through association, knew only that he could not continue being what the Imperium required, could not keep killing the faithful while calling it salvation, could not wear the armor of an angel while acting like a demon and pretending the distinction didn't matter. The warp swallowed his ship like a throat closing around food, and for the first time in 70 years, Castiel felt something that might have been fear or freedom, or perhaps they were the same thing. On Sanctum Majoris, Inquisitor Valerian received priority orders to investigate the Crimson Templars for suspected corruption. His first response was dark amusement, the Imperium asking him to investigate whether its greatest warriors had become too human to function. The irony was so thick he could taste it like blood. His second response was terror, because if he conducted this investigation honestly, he would find corruption everywhere, would find doubt in every chapter, would find mercy flowering in darkness like fungus on a corpse, would have to report that the Imperium's brutality was creating exactly the heresy it claimed to fight, turning its own angels into enemies through the simple act of remembering they were supposed to protect rather than destroy. He could lie in his report, say he found nothing, allow the infection to spread, watch the Imperium slowly devour itself from within as more and more soldiers remembered their humanity and broke under the weight of their atrocities. Or he could tell the truth and watch the Inquisition burn entire chapters to ash in the name of purity, execute thousands for the crime of doubt, prove once again that mercy was weakness and questioning was heresy, and the Imperium would rather destroy itself than admit it might be wrong. Both options ended in darkness. Both paths led to damnation. The only difference was how long the fall would take and how many would die screaming on the way down. Valerian made his choice, deleted his secret archives. Every file, every case study, every piece of evidence documenting the Imperium's systematic brutality against its own faithful. 17,000 documented atrocities erased as if they had never existed. Then he composed his report to the Inquisitorial Conclave. Investigation complete. Crimson Templars show no signs of corruption. Minor doctrinal drift detected and corrected through spiritual counseling. Chapter remains loyal and combat effective. Recommend no further action. The lies came easily, flowed like water, tasted like ash but served their purpose. He transmitted the report, then opened a vial of poison he had carried for 2 centuries. Kept it for emergencies, for moments when the weight became too much, for times when serving the Imperium meant betraying everything that made service meaningful. The poison was ancient, derived from Deathworld flora, painless but absolute. He had used it on heretics who deserved mercy rather than torture. Now he would use it on himself for the same reason. Valerian swallowed the poison, sat back in his throne, and waited for darkness. His last thought was a prayer that the Emperor would forgive him for the truths he had buried, the lies he had told, the system he had served knowing it was broken beyond repair. The prayer went unanswered. Perhaps the Emperor could not hear him through 10,000 years of agony. Perhaps he heard but had no forgiveness to offer. Perhaps forgiveness was irrelevant in a galaxy that ran on necessity and suffering and the mathematics of survival. The poison took him gently. A lie that felt like truth. Mercy disguised as execution. Justice served through abandonment. When his staff found him 3 hours later, they catalogued his death as heart failure brought on by stress. No investigation followed. No questions were asked. Inquisitors died all the time, worn out by the weight of protecting an Imperium that could never be protected enough. They burned his body according to ritual, scattered his ashes in the void, erased him from records with efficiency that suggested practice. Within a week, it was as if he had never existed. Another spark extinguished, another question silenced, another truth buried so deep it would never see light again. But his final lie survived. His false report protected the Crimson Templars from investigation, gave them time, gave the infection space to spread, gave mercy a chance to flower in darkness even though he would never know it. Valerian's last act was truth disguised as deception, rebellion wrapped in loyalty, heresy that served the Emperor better than faith ever could. On a dozen worlds, Mira's network grew. Not organized, not centralized, just people finding each other through shared grief, teaching their children that questions were not heresy, preserving fragments of humanity the Imperium was systematically destroying. They called themselves Nothing, had no name, no structure, no leadership, were barely connected enough to qualify as a movement. But they existed. They remembered. They asked why angels could not weep. And in asking, they became dangerous in ways the Imperium had no protocols for handling. The sparks were spreading. The infection was growing. And somewhere in the warp, the nameless entity born from hope-turned-corruption fed on their questions, grew stronger on their doubts, shaped itself into something that might save humanity, or damn it completely depending on perspective and which truths you were willing to face. The storm had broken. The thunder had passed. But the rain continued, soft, persistent, eroding certainty, wearing away conviction, proving that even stone eventually yields to water given enough time and enough patience and enough accumulated drops that individually meant nothing but collectively changed everything. Castiel drifted through the warp alone, his ship damaged, his faith shattered, his purpose unknown. Valerian lay dead, his secrets buried, his final act a lie that might save thousands. Mira held her daughter close and taught her prayers that asked questions instead of demanding obedience. 3 sparks, 3 choices, 3 souls who had decided that humanity meant more than survival and paid the price for that decision. The Imperium endured, as it always had, as it always would, grinding forward through darkness, consuming its own children to fuel its eternal hunger, calling brutality necessity and cruelty mercy and damnation salvation. But something had changed. Some balance had shifted, some foundation had cracked. And in the golden throne room on Terra, the Emperor stirred again, not in movement, but in awareness, felt the network spreading, felt the questions multiplying, felt his angels falling not into chaos but into something harder to define, something that looked like humanity and might be corruption or might be the salvation he had always intended before 10,000 years twisted his vision into nightmare. If he could have spoken, he might have told them they were right, that faith should bring grace, not suffering, that mercy was strength, not weakness, that angels should weep. But he could not speak, could only burn, could only watch, could only hope that somewhere in the darkness his children would remember what they were supposed to be before the Imperium made them into monsters. The galaxy turned. History continued. And 3 sparks burned in darkness, waiting to see if they would ignite revolution or be extinguished like all the sparks before them, forgotten by a universe too vast to notice individual lights no matter how desperately they tried to shine. Years passed like ash through fingers, counted not in imperial dating systems, but in lives lived and lost, in children born into a galaxy that had forgotten how to be gentle, in prayers whispered that asked questions the Imperium had spent 10 millennia trying to silence. Mira grew old in a hab unit on Sanctum Majoris that smelled of recycled air and fading hope, her hands scarred from factory work, her eyes carrying memories of tunnels and angels and a husband who had died loyal to an Imperium that killed him anyway. Ella grew into a woman who taught other children the dangerous art of questioning, who preserved her mother's stories like sacred texts, who understood that faith in the Emperor and faith in his Imperium were not the same thing, and the distinction mattered more than survival itself. The network spread across 17 sectors, touching thousands of lives, infecting them with the simple idea that humanity meant more than mathematics, that individual sparks mattered even in a galaxy that treated them as fuel for an eternal engine. They did not rebel, did not raise weapons, did not betray the Imperium to its enemies, simply existed as proof that mercy could survive in darkness, that questions were not heresy, that angels should weep when they kill the faithful. This was sedition of the quietest kind, revolution practiced through remembrance, heresy that looked exactly like devotion until you examined it closely enough to see the cracks. The Inquisition never found them, or perhaps found them and decided they were too scattered to matter, too small to justify the resources required for extermination. Or perhaps some inquisitors saw what Valerian had seen, understood what he had understood, and made the same choice to look away and let mercy flower in whatever spaces brutality had not yet reached. The Imperium was vast enough to contain multitudes, large enough that even its own contradictions could coexist without immediate collision, brutal enough to crush dissent but paradoxically too brutal to notice when dissent wore the face of faith. Castiel's Thunderhawk emerged from the warp near a world the charts called Absolution, though he suspected it had other names, older names, names spoken by civilizations that had existed before the Imperium consumed them. The planet was gray and quiet and ringed by debris fields that might have been destroyed ships or natural asteroids or both. He landed in ruins that looked like they had once been a cathedral, back when cathedrals were built to inspire rather than intimidate. The architecture was wrong for the Imperium. Too graceful, too human, too focused on beauty rather than the relentless functionality that characterized Imperial construction. He found others there. Space Marines from chapters he recognized, and some he did not, all of them bearing the same weight in their eyes, the same exhaustion in their movements, the same infection of mercy that had made them incompatible with the Imperium's requirements. They did not speak much, did not need to. Their presence was confession and absolution combined, proof that he was not alone in his fall, evidence that angels could doubt without becoming demons, could question without betraying their oaths, could remember their humanity without surrendering to chaos. They had built something in the ruins, not a fortress, not a monastery, something harder to define. A sanctuary, perhaps, a place where warriors who had served brutality could learn to serve something gentler, where faith could exist without demanding suffering, where the Emperor's vision could be preserved in forms his Imperium would call heresy, but might actually be closer to his original intent before 10,000 years of necessity twisted it into nightmare. They trained, prayed, meditated on questions the Codex Astartes forbade asking. Slowly, painfully, tried to unlearn what they had been and discover what they might become. Castiel joined them without ceremony, removed his armor piece by piece, each section representing an oath betrayed or fulfilled depending on perspective. Beneath the ceramite he was smaller than he remembered, scarred beyond recognition, marked by surgeries that had transformed him from human into weapon. He looked at his reflection in polished metal and barely recognized the face staring back. Wondered who he had been before the apothecarian rebuilt him. Wondered if that person would be proud or horrified by what he had become and what he was becoming now. An old warrior named Severus found him staring at his reflection. Severus wore scars that told stories of 100 campaigns, bore chapter markings that had been carefully scraped away, spoke with a voice that sounded like gravel and regret mixed together. "You are looking for the boy you were," Severus said. "He's gone. The Imperium killed him the day they cut you open and rebuilt you into their image. But what remains can still choose, can still decide whether to be weapon or guardian, destroyer or protector, angel of death or simply angel." Castiel did not answer immediately. Let the words settle like dust. Finally spoke a truth he had never voiced before. "I do not know if I can be anything other than what they made me. Do not know if there is enough humanity left to build something new from these ruins." Severus smiled, and the expression was sad and knowing and strangely gentle. "None of us know, brother. That is why we try, because trying is the only rebellion that matters, the only heresy that might actually save us." They trained together in forms that emphasized restraint rather than lethality, practiced shooting to disable rather than kill, learned the difficult art of measuring threat without assuming everyone was an enemy. It was harder than any combat Castiel had ever experienced. Required unlearning decades of conditioning. Demanded he trust his judgment rather than protocol. Expected him to see people instead of targets and act accordingly even when protocol screamed that hesitation meant death. Most days he failed. Some days he succeeded. Slowly, imperceptibly, he began to change. On Sanctum Majoris, Mira died quietly in her sleep at the age of 73, her hand held by a daughter who had become the living embodiment of her questions, her last words a prayer that asked the Emperor to forgive her for loving him more than his Imperium. They burned her body according to custom, scattered her ashes in the factory district where she had worked for 40 years, marked her passing with silence rather than ceremony because she had been no one important. No one the Imperium would remember, just another spark extinguished by time if not by violence. But Ella remembered, and Ella's students remembered, and the network remembered. Her story spread across 17 sectors, carried by people who had never met her but recognized her grief as their own, understood her questions as universal, saw in her life proof that resistance could be practiced through simple existence, through refusing to let the Imperium grind away everything that made humans human. She became myth, legend, the woman who had survived an angel's mercy and built a philosophy from that survival. Truth wrapped in metaphor, history transformed into prayer. The Crimson Templars continued their crusades, killing in the Emperor's name, purging corruption, protecting humanity through methods that looked indistinguishable from the threats they claimed to fight. They never spoke of Castiel, erased him from their records with efficiency that suggested shame, or perhaps respect, or perhaps simple necessity. The chaplain who had offered him exile died in battle 17 years later. His last words a prayer that might have been confession or benediction, or simply acknowledgement that some questions had no answers. New brothers joined the chapter, were rebuilt into weapons, served with distinction. Some of them hesitated during purges. Some of them showed mercy when protocol demanded execution. Some of them remembered they were supposed to protect rather than destroy. The infection spread, slowly, quietly, changing the chapter in ways so gradual they might not notice for centuries. Or perhaps they would never notice. Perhaps mercy would remain a secret practice, hidden beneath orthodoxy. Expressed only in moments too small for official records, the Imperium endured, as it always had, grinding forward through an infinity of darkness, consuming trillions to fuel its eternal war against extinction, calling this necessary, calling this just, calling this the only way humanity could survive in a galaxy designed to devour it. And perhaps this was true. Perhaps the mathematics really did demand such brutality. Perhaps any alternative would result in humanity's extinction within a generation. But perhaps, just perhaps, survival, purchased through the systematic destruction of everything that made survival meaningful, was not actually survival at all, but slow suicide practiced across millennia. The questions lingered, grew, spread like radiation through Imperial space, not organized into rebellion, not weaponized into revolution, just existing as constant pressure against the certainty that held the Imperium together. What are we surviving for if survival requires becoming monsters? Can faith exist without questions? Should angels weep? Does the Emperor know what is done in his name? Would he approve if he could speak? Or would he weep for what his vision has become? No answers came. None were expected. The Imperium did not traffic in answers, only in necessity and mathematics and the brutal calculus of survival. But the questions themselves were rebellion enough, proof that humanity had not been completely crushed, evidence that mercy could survive even in spaces designed to extinguish it, promise that perhaps eventually the Imperium might remember it was supposed to serve humanity rather than the other way around. On Absolution, Castiel stood on a promontory watching twin suns set over ruins that predated the Imperium by millennia. His armor discarded, his weapons laid aside, his purpose redefined through years of practice and failure and slow, painful transformation. He was no longer a space marine. Not really. Had become something the Imperium had no name for. Guardian, perhaps. Protector, without the certainty that made protection simple. Warrior, who understood that sometimes the greatest strength was knowing when not to fight. Severus joined him, both of them watching light die across ancient stone. "Do you think we made the right choice?" the old warrior asked. "Abandoning our chapters, choosing mercy over duty, becoming what the Imperium would call traitors?" Castiel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Thought about the woman and child he had spared, about the 400 faithful he had protected by refusing to execute them, about the brothers who had followed his example and spread the infection further, about all the lives saved through small mercies practiced in darkness. "I think we chose to remember we were human," Castiel said finally. "Whether that was right or wrong depends on questions I cannot answer. Whether humanity deserves to survive, if survival requires abandoning humanity. Whether faith means obedience or conscience. Whether the Emperor wanted soldiers or sons." He paused, watched the suns touch the horizon. "I hope we chose correctly. But hope is all I have left. And perhaps hope is enough." They stood in silence as darkness claimed the world. Two fallen angels watching night arrive, wondering if their rebellion mattered or if they were just more sparks being slowly extinguished by a universe too vast to notice individual lights. Behind them, other exiles gathered for evening prayers. Their words were familiar but altered, asking questions instead of making demands, seeking grace instead of victory, requesting wisdom to know when mercy was strength and when strength required mercy. Far away, on Terra, locked in the golden throne, drowning in agony that had lasted longer than memory, the Emperor stirred. Not physically, never physically, but psychically in ways that transcended mortal comprehension. He felt the network spreading, the questions multiplying, his angels falling into humanity and perhaps rising into something closer to his original vision. If he could have wept, he might have wept for joy, or sorrow, or perhaps both, recognizing that his Imperium had become exactly what he had feared, exactly what he had tried to prevent, exactly what 10,000 years of necessity had demanded. But he could not weep, could only burn, could only watch, could only hope that somewhere in the darkness his children would find the path he could no longer illuminate, that they would remember faith should bring grace, that angels should weep, that humanity meant more than survival, that individual sparks mattered even in a galaxy that treated them as fuel. The prayer went out across the Imperium, carried by a million voices, most of them unaware they were part of something larger. Just people asking questions, teaching their children to remember their humanity, showing small mercies in spaces where mercy should not survive, practicing rebellion through the simple act of remaining human in a galaxy designed to crush them into machines. It was not enough to change the Imperium, would never be enough. The Imperium was too vast, too old, too committed to its brutal mathematics to be altered by anything as fragile as hope. But it was enough to prove that humanity had not been completely extinguished, that mercy could survive in darkness, that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, there were still those who remembered there should be more than war, should be grace, should be compassion, should be the possibility that angels could weep for what they did in the Emperor's name. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough. Not victory, not salvation, just proof that the fight was not over, that the question remained unanswered, that humanity's soul had not been completely sold for the price of survival, that somewhere in the infinite dark, sparks still burned bright enough to hope, the suns set completely, darkness claimed absolution, And in that darkness fallen angels prayed for grace they did not expect to receive, mercy they had not earned, forgiveness for crimes committed in faith and necessity, and the brutal mathematics of survival. Their prayers were not answered, perhaps could never be answered. Perhaps the Emperor could not hear them through 10,000 years of agony. Perhaps he heard but had nothing to offer except his own suffering as proof that even gods could break beneath the weight of duty. But they prayed anyway, because praying was human, because questions were sacred, because angels should weep even if they had forgotten how. And somewhere in the warp, the nameless entity born from hope-turned-doubt listened to those prayers and grew stronger, shaped itself into something that might damn humanity, or save it, depending on which truths you were willing to face and which lies you were willing to abandon. The story does not end, cannot end, will continue as long as the Imperium grinds forward and sparks refuse to be extinguished, and angels remember they were human once before being transformed into weapons. The outcome is not certain. Perhaps the network will grow until it challenges the Imperium's foundations. Perhaps it will be crushed and forgotten like all rebellions before it. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the question itself is more important than any answer. But this much is certain. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, there are still those who ask why. Still those who show mercy when mathematics demands cruelty. Still those who remember that humanity means more than survival, and faith requires more than obedience, and angels should weep when they kill the faithful. Whether that is enough to matter, only time will tell. And time, in the 41st millennium, is measured in eternities of suffering broken by moments of grace too small for history to record but too important for souls to forget. If this story made you question what faith requires and whether mercy can survive in the far future, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moral complexities of Warhammer 40k. Drop a comment with your answer to this. Is the Imperium's brutality necessary for humanity's survival, or has it become the very corruption it claims to fight? Share this story with anyone who believes that even in the darkest galaxy, individual choices still matter. Until next time, remember, the Emperor protects, but sometimes we must protect each other from those who claim to speak for him.